We are on day 25 of MLK Uncut. So I'm just gonna give myself a hand clap and give myself a pat on the back for getting through this book. So good morning to those who are coming in live. I pray that you will share this broadcast, and I'm hoping that we can get through this broadcast completely without it cutting off. I am also running my broadcast via live stream on YouTube at Church Love 333. That is the channel. So feel free, if this does accidentally cut off, feel free to continue with me over there. So again, we are reading, and we have been reading MLK's works. We started with Why We Can't Wait. And if you'd like to go back and look at any of those videos, you can follow the hashtag, type in the hashtag to Facebook, hashtag Why We Can't Wait, and it will pull up all of those videos. And we spent about 12 days in reading that book. Now we are completing, where do we go from here, chaos or community? So if you would like to follow any of these previous videos, readings, discussions, you can type in the hashtag chaos or community, and it will pull up every single day that we have been in this book. We have covered some of everything, and I have my little list here today as we close out, just to kind of share with you some of the things that we have talked about and that MLK talked about in detail in his work. I hear a lot of people throwing MLK's name around, saying what he would do, what he wouldn't do, what he would say, what he wouldn't say. But it's so wonderful that he actually left a record of how he felt on certain issues. So we don't really have to wonder what was in MLK's mind concerning these things, even the things we see in 2016, because he left some records. So this is where we've been. Chaos or Community was actually his last work that he wrote before he was assassinated. So I definitely would recommend getting this book for yourself, getting into it, digging into some of these concepts that I'm going to talk about that was covered in this book, so that you can get a really good handle on what was the climate like, how are we paralleling that climate today, and making sure that you are the change that you want to see, that you're part of the solution, that you are not falling into the same political arguments that were used against the Black community 49 years ago that are still being used today, and that you are a part of the solution. So in his book, he covers things like white backlash, which we can clearly see happening with the Kaepernick situation. White backlash, what happens when you don't protest or when you do something that angers white America. He talks about the North and the South. He talks about the differences in how race and race relations play out, and how racism is acted out in the North versus the South. That's very important to understand. He talked about the emergence of Black power and the issues and the problems he had with the Black Power movement. And he also talked about the positive things that you could take away from the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers. He talked about slave making. He talked about restoring worth to the Black community, because for so long, worth had been stripped out and stripped away. He talked about the dilemmas in a revolution. He talked about the futility of using violence in your quest for liberation and equality. He talked about white fears and how those fears would affect people's desire to even want to share power. He talked about doctrines from hell that this country was established on, doctrines of inferiority, one of them being, that permeates our society, that permeates education, that permeates science, that permeates religion. So unfortunately, some of those doctrines are still permeating our society and they need to be addressed. because people are still teaching error, especially in the area of religion. He talked about poison minds, how when you poison a person's mind, you lead them down the road to moral famine. He talked about white allies, that not everybody is your enemy. You know, not everybody is a neo-Nazi. Not everybody is a American fascist. There are people, you know, that are not African American that can be allies to work with Black America. He talked about the church, how the church has been compromised in areas that the church has been negligent in. He talked about the Black family. He talked about the ghettos and the ghetto structure in society. He talked about inequality. He talked about, excuse me, how those ghettos formed. He talked about suburbia and how, you know, these highways and things that were built allowed people to drive past the deprivation that was happening in communities. So if I can drive past it and ignore it, then I don't have to pay attention to it. He talked about the American racial revolution. He talked about sources of power, ideological, economic, political. He talked about having a real voice in politics and not sending people to represent the Black community who then become a silent voice when it's time to speak on behalf of the Black community. He talked about the real CIA being a conscious, informed, and alert people acting in the best interests of your people group. He talked about the weaknesses of the Black community. And then he began this section. What we talked about, the last section, was about abolition of widespread poverty and how he was moving his campaign from just focusing on inequality in Black America to the Poor People's Campaign. And we know at that point he was assassinated. So very awesome work, very fascinating work, subjects. I was very impressed because MLK gives a very balanced view of what was going on in the times. You know, he talked about what was good. He talked about what needed improvement. He talked about what wasn't working. And so oftentimes when we read a book, sometimes it's a very, very slanted view. But MLK was giving everybody to work. He was not hedging on anything. And so that's why I appreciate this reading. So today we're actually looking at the appendix that he put in, which was the programs and the prospects that they were putting forth to our government that, to my understanding, some of these things as he was writing never got looked at, never got reviewed. And that was 49 years ago. And clearly we could see the results of them not listening. Where are we going after this? We are going to continue starting on Monday. We're going to do a new series. We'll still call this MLK Uncut, but you'll be following the hashtag The Radical King. So this is where we're going next. If you'd like to get the book and read along with us, this was actually compiled by Cornell West, and it is MLK's messages to different groups, things that he spoke in front of, you know, congressmen, and also some sermons as well that are tied into this book that we're going to be taking a look at next. So if you'd like to follow us and continue with the readings, you can check out this book here, The Radical King, is where we're going next. All right. So let's get into checking out the programs and the prospects that were kind of pitched as ideas to our government. And as MLK stated, you know, his thing was, if they want full-blown proposals of these things, they could have had it. But he said one of the things that they ran into was government bureaucracy and stalling in their efforts to want to help Black America. There was lots of stalling going on. There was lots of postponing going on. There was lots of, we need to see more. We need to see more information before they would actually enact certain things. So that was 49 years ago. Has much changed? No. So this really is to me an admonishment for our generation to press more and demand more of our current government. So let's look at education here. American society has emphasized education more than European society. The purpose is to use education to make a break between the occupation of the parents and those of their children. Schools have been the historic routes of social mobility. But when the Negroes and others of the underclass now ask that schools play the same function for them, many within and outside the school system answer that the schools cannot do the job. They would impose on the family the whole task of preparing and leading youngsters into educational advance. And this reluctance to engage with the great issue of our day, the full emancipation and equality of Negroes and the poor, comes at a time when education is more than ever a passport to decent economic positions. Whatever pathology may exist in Negro families is far exceeded by this social pathology in the school system that refuses to accept the responsibility that no one else can bear and then scapegoats Negro families for failing to do the job. The scattered evidence suggesting that family life is important in educational progress provides only partial support for the rationalizations of educators, for family life explains only a small portion of learning difficulties. The job of the school is to teach so well that family background is no longer an issue. Now, having been, and I am an educator, I'm not currently in a school system right now, but having been in the school systems for 15 years, I can definitely say that if you teach well, family background no longer becomes an issue. I had excellent teachers myself. Some of them loved me, some of them hated me, some of them were racist, and they told me so. But if your job as a teacher is to teach, as he said, if you're teaching, family background no longer becomes an issue. As that person begins to get a quality education, they're able to move and be mobilized to a better quality of life. So I actually do agree with that. The problem is, are teachers having the opportunity, are teachers having the time to teach well? That's our current dilemma in especially in public school. Are we teaching well, or are we teaching to a test? Are we teaching well? Are we being equipped to teach well? I came out of a teaching program that at the time, I still believe it is, but at the time, it was the #1 teacher preparation program in the country. So we're saying we want teachers to teach well, but we also need to equip them so that they can teach well. Then we also need to have a curriculum, right, that represents good teaching. Some of the curriculums need an overhaul. So I do agree with this, that the job of the school is to teach so well that family background is no longer the issue for that child being able to move forth. He goes on to say, the sad truth is that American schools, by and large, do not know how to teach, nor frequently what to teach. The ineffectiveness of teaching reading skills to many young people, whether white or black, excuse me, poor or rich, strongly indicts foundations and government for not spending funds effectively to find out what different kinds of reading experiences are needed by youth, while various learning styles at various points in their life. While we aim for the moon, we putter around in academic gardens without even a relief map. We have been timid in trying to improve schools. Operation Head Start has shown that a little work before school cannot insulate children from the impact of poor teaching and poor schools. Programs that throw a little money into a school for counseling or remedial reading instruction cannot prepare youth for the educational needs of today. The task is considerable. It is not merely to bring Negroes up to higher educational levels, but to close the gap between their educational levels and those of whites. If this does not happen, as Negroes advance educationally, whites will be moving ahead even more rapidly. Despite the despair and regret over past educational failures, we have not seriously begun to approach the needs of Negro and poor youngsters. The data of a Carnegie-sponsored study show that the differences in educational expenditure between center cities and suburbs have widened since the late 50s. Instead of spending relatively more on the disadvantage of the big cities, we are spending less. Another tragic example of the inversion of priorities which plagues American societies. And of course, we know with all of the stuff that has happened between last year and I believe the early part of this year, you also have the problem of mismanagement of funds, which we saw in Chicago and Detroit. How is it that you have schools so run down that mold is growing inside? Are you kidding me? Just horrible, like third world country conditions in schools. And then you get to the bottom of it and you have administrators in these schools, right? Who are misusing the funds they do have. So you've also got to look at that. It's bureaucracy issues from the government. It's taxpayer issues. You don't have a funding base if most of your community is abandoned houses. There's no taxpayer money going into your community to pay for public schools. And then the money that you are getting, those who are in leadership are misusing the funds. So there's a lot of different issues going on in our day and time. Much more money has to be spent on education of the children of the poor. The rate of increase in expenditures for the poor has to be much greater than for the well-off of the children of the poor, if the children of the poor are to catch up. The road to effective education requires helping teachers to teach more effectively. The use of non-professional aides would reduce class size and provide needed assistance to teachers. More direct training and aid in teaching youngsters from low-income families is needed. Parents should be involved in the schools to a much greater extent, breaking down the barriers between professionals and the community that they serve. Education is too important today to be left to professional fads and needs. This is not to assert that professional competence is unnecessary, but that there must be a greater evidence of competence and a new and creative link between parents and schools. Now, there are some developments that have happened, of course, within the last 49 years in regards to that. There are states that are recognizing that teachers' aides are needed. I know, 2 states now, Virginia and Florida, that have been able to reduce class size with the use of unprofessional aides, right? So there has been things that MLK pointed out that we do see happening. The other piece here that he talks about is you don't need to leave education to professional fads and needs, right? There are certain things about the educational process that should not change. But when you get into professional fads, then you move away from actually educating the kids to making them experiments. And we don't need experimentation happening. They need actual education. They need actual learning to occur. He goes on to say schools have to be infused with a mission if they are to be successful. The mission is clear: the rapid improvement of the school performance of Black America and other poor children. If this does not happen, America will suffer for decades to come. Yeah. Where a missionary zeal has been demonstrated by school administrators and teachers, and where this dedication has been backed by competence, funds, and a desire to involve parents, much has been accomplished. But by and large, American educators, despite occasional rhetoric, have not dedicated themselves to the rapid improvement of the education of the poor. So one of the questions that then comes up is, do we want parents in schools? Because from what I have seen, and I'm talking private sector, I'm talking public sector, I'm talking working with parents that have young children, the refrains I often hear are, I have to give the school a 24-hour notice, a 48-hour notice. Some schools don't want the parents in the classroom. Some schools don't want the parents observing what's going on in the classroom. Some schools are not releasing records like they're supposed to be releasing. So there's a lot of stuff going on the school level, that when he talks about this partnership between parents and schools, doesn't show that there's a partnership happening, or doesn't show that there's a willingness for a partnership. It really depends on the school district, on the administration, and how they feel about a parent-school partnership. So you have some schools that are like, yes, 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 give us all the parent involvement we can take. We want parents in here. We want parents observing. We want parents volunteering. Then you have other schools that are like, keep the parents out. Put security on the doors. Yeah. So that's something that is, I would say, needs to have a national overhaul. And then, of course, now we have the issues of what's happening while your child is in a space, that is now edicts coming down from the executive office, that's making students feel uncomfortable and students feel unsafe, because we want to dig into sexuality while making the majority of the population, putting girls and boys in unsafe environments in a school setting. Yeah. So MLK does have a point, but the question is, do schools really want a link, a connection, a partnership between parents and schools? I'll continue on. Aside from finances, a major reason for the absence of dedication to the great problem of contemporary American education has been the issue of integration. Integrated education has been charged with diminishing the quality of education of whites. Integrated education does not retard white students, while it does improve the performance of Black students. So, of course, we know during his day, they were still working on integrating schools. Unfortunately, even in 2016, there's still schools in America that have yet to be integrated. Do the research. You'll find one. Yeah. So there was this belief that if you put African American students in schools with white Americans, that it would retard their education. The study showed that wasn't true. Unfortunately, you still have people that believe that. That's why some of them are taking their kids out of public schools and putting them in charter schools, putting them in private schools. So we would love to think that the mindset is just, oh, I want my kids to have a better quality education, which is in many cases that is the mindset. But some of the other mindset is, there are too many brown and Black people in this school, therefore, almost like the housing, what happens in the housing market. When a certain amount of Black and brown people move into a neighborhood, all of a sudden, the white people start putting their houses up for sale and they move out. Some of that is also happening in education. I'll keep reading. Quality education for all is most likely to come through educational parks, which bring together in one place all the students of a large area. Because of the economies of large-scale operation, the educational park will make practical multiplicity of teaching specialists and superb facilities. Involving students from a wide area attracted by superior opportunities, such a plan will guarantee school integration even before housing is desegregated. Then he goes on to say, the educational park is likely to be the next great structure for education. Funds should come from the federal government, which must move from supporting the fringes of education to supporting the basics, the teachers and the facilities with which they work. The federal government should begin to provide building grants to local school districts, groups of districts, so that educational parks can be constructed. Building grants should go to localities, cities, and suburbs, which locate schools so as to promote integration. The arbitrary lines of government should not serve to balkanize America into white and black schools and communities. Now, this idea of the educational park, to me, has actually filtered over into technology, because now you can be educated on just about anything. You can have your child do virtual school as opposed to doing a public school setting. So there's so many different ways now that your child can be educated, that they don't have to be limited to that building or that structure anymore. But of course, this was 49 years ago that he is speaking, but he's kind of talking about this bigger picture, this bigger concept of being able to educate students and give them quality and equal education. And I like to say that the World Wide Web has opened up so many opportunities for your children to get a quality education and not be stuck in the traditional school setting. All right, so let's go to what he says here about employment. What are some things that they talked about with employment? Give you the last piece he said here on education. The United States is far from providing each child with as much education as he can use. Our school system still primarily functions as a system of exclusion. For the oldest generation of Negroes, the time for effective educational remedies may be already past, but there is an enormous reservoir of talent among Black and other poor youth. This society has to develop that talent. The unrealized capacities of many of our youth are an indictment of our society's lack of concern for justice and its proclivity for wasting human resources. As with so much else in this potentially great society, injustice and waste go together and endanger stability. Employment. Economic expansion cannot alone do the job of improving the employment situation of Negroes. It provides the base for improvement, but other things must be constructed upon it, especially if the tragic situation of youth is to be solved. In a booming economy, Negro youth are afflicted with unemployment as though in an economic crisis. They are the explosive outsiders of the American expansion. The insistence on educational certificates and credentials for skilled and semi-skilled jobs is keeping Negroes out of both the private business sector and government employment. Negro exclusion is not the purpose of the insistence upon credentials, but it is the inevitable consequence today. The orientation of personnel offices should be jobs first, training later. Unfortunately, the job policy of the federal programs has largely been the reverse, with the result that people are being trained for non-existent jobs. And I think he actually has a very good point there, that people spend a lot of time in training and then they get out of these trainings and there's no jobs available for them. And MLK is saying that actually the reverse should be happening, that you should be providing people jobs and training them while they're on the job. Training becomes a way of avoiding the issue of employment, for it does not ask the employer to change his policies and job structures. Instead of training for uncertain jobs, the policy of the government should be to subsidize American business to employ individuals whose education is limited. This policy may be considered a bribe by some, but it is a step consonant with reality. We require a vast expansion of present programs of on-the-job training, in which training costs are absorbed by the government. At another level, employers could be granted reduced taxes if they employ difficult to place workers. Now, I think that's actually a brilliant idea. How many businesses would be willing to employ difficult to place workers if they were granted a reduction in taxes? Or if they were granted several years of tax-free income, if they were incentivized to employ difficult to place workers. Well, what is a difficult to place worker? Maybe someone who has a criminal record that's non-violent and they're just getting out of the prison system and they need to find employment. They're usually the most difficult to place. But MLK is proposing here that employers could be granted reduced taxes if they employ difficult to place workers. There are probably plenty of businesses that would jump on board with that if you offered tax incentives to start these people's economy. He says here, many states have merit reductions in unemployment taxes for employers with a good record of sustained employment. Why not a merit reward for hiring the difficult to place? In some European countries, employers are required to have certain percentage of physically handicapped persons in their labor force. Why not a similar requirement here for the difficult to place? The big new attractive thrust of Negro employment is in the non-professional services. A high percentage of these jobs is in public employment. Then he goes on to say, the expansion of the human services can be the missing industry that will soak up the unemployment that persists in the United States. Secretary of Labor at the time has talked about missing industry that would change the employment scene in America. I believe the expansion of human services is that industry. It is labor intensive, requiring manpower immediately, rather than heavy capital investment as in construction or other fields. It fills a great need not met by private enterprise. It involves labor that can be trained and developed on the job. The growth of the human services should be rapid. It should be developed in a manner ensuring that jobs generated will not primarily be for professionals with college and postgraduate diplomas, but for people from the neighborhoods who can perform important functions for their neighborhoods. So MLK is basically saying there are a whole lot of jobs that can be created, right? That can be on the job training jobs for people from their neighborhood who can perform a function in their neighborhood, you know, like community cleanup jobs, like gutting out these abandoned houses jobs, like neighborhood revitalization jobs, right? So as with private enterprise, he says, rigid credentials have monopolized the entry routes into human services employment. But as Frank Reisman and Arthur Pearl have argued in their book, New Careers for the Poor, less educated people can do many of the tasks now performed by the highly educated, as well as many other new and necessary tasks. They should be trained on the job. Those who have had trouble with school in their youth and have not earned their credentials should be trained on the job, get university credit for their experience, learn in relevant courses, and develop a liberal arts knowledge that is built around their concerns. We need what S.M. Miller has called second chance universities. A democratic educational system requires multiple doors to get employment. This is brilliant. We do actually now have lots of what people would call second chance universities or tech colleges where people can go and they can get a AA degree or they can get a certificate in a certain skill. So we do see that playing out in our society, but I want to go back to what he pointed out is, why don't you give people in their neighborhood jobs in their neighborhood, that they can perform functions in their neighborhood so that they can feel pride in their neighborhood, rather than wanting to burn down their neighborhood because they don't have a job. They have too much time on their hands. When you have too much time on your hands, as people are now complaining with all these riots and da 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 and blah blah blah, if you want them to stop burning down neighborhoods, give them a job that serves in their neighborhood. I guarantee you, we'll stop burning down what we build up. People will stop burning down what they build up, what they have pride in. Okay, I'm gonna leave that alone. I'm gonna get off my soapbox. All right. He goes on to say, he talks about AP Randolph presents a freedom budget, and he says the freedom budget is important because it provides a basis for common action with labor and other groups in utilizing the economic growth of this nation to benefit the poor as well as the rich. It raises the possibility of rebuilding America so that private affluence is not accompanied by public squalor of slums and distress. The freedom budget, the expansion of private employment and non-professional opportunities, cannot, however, provide full employment for Negroes. Many youths are not listed as unemployed because in despair, they have left the labor market completely. And this is one of the things that many people are saying about the unemployment numbers, that many of the unemployment numbers are not really telling or showing the whole picture, that some of these people have left the labor market completely. They're no longer trying. They have lost hope. They are in despair. And so they're not being calculated into the total number of people actually unemployed. He goes on to say they are psychologically disabled and cannot be rescued by conventional employment. They need workplaces where their irregularity as workers can be accepted until they have restored their habits of discipline. The jobs should nevertheless be jobs and understood as such, not given the false label of training. Among the employed, where discrimination continues to operate, discrepancies in pay between blacks and whites are ubiquitous. This discrepancy occurs because blacks are paid less for the same job. 2, a heavier proportion of Negroes work in the low-wage South. 3, smaller percentages of blacks are in high-wage jobs. The first could be eliminated by more effective policing of fair employment practices. The second is partly changing as blacks leave the South, though more important would be effective unionization of the South and the Southern jobs. The third requires a strong effort of government and private employers and schools and colleges to develop upgrading practices which give Negroes a chance at the better jobs. Again, access and opportunity. Access and opportunity. Because what we are finding, even in 2016, that with all of the education that some Black Americans do have, masters, doctorates, bachelors, college educated, some of those doors are still closed. In his generation, they believed that education was the key to an open door. 49 years later, we have highly qualified and highly educated Black Americans who still can't find a job. Which is why, as Dr. Carson pointed out in his book, Think Big, I recommend people read that book. It's an excellent book. He says, you can have education, but you also need access and opportunity. Those three together help a person to move forward. So don't just tell me get educated, and then I go and get educated, and then I get out, and I still don't have access, and I still don't have opportunity to employment. All right. MLK is moving on. He's going into the section of rights in housing, and we are going to be done. So I do believe we're going to finish all today. Rights. The proliferating bureaucracies in a complex industrial society tend to curtail democratic rights. Those that affect the affluent and powerful can be handled by appeals to the courts, which have power to prohibit unwarranted decrees or decisions beyond the scope of proper authority. The poor, however, are helpless in many cases. In welfare, public housing, education, arbitrary use of power cannot be arrested by means readily available to the victimized. In most cases, the victim does not know he has legal redress and accepts the role of a supplicant, unprotected by rules, regulations, and safeguards. There's a relationship between professionals and those they have a duty to service, but too often humiliate or neglect. From a variety of different directions, strands are drawing together for a contemporary social and economic Bill of Rights to supplement the Constitution's political Bill of Rights. And I love the fact that MLK circles around to this fact that the Constitution does address your political rights, but sometimes it doesn't address human rights, and it doesn't address social and economic rights. And he also coined this a Bill of Rights for the poor. What are the rights that should be there for the poor that doesn't humiliate them and doesn't neglect them? He goes on to say, the new forms of rights are new methods of participation in decision making. The concept of democracy is being pushed to deeper levels of meaning, from a formal exercise of voting, still an issue in much of the United States, to effective participation in major decisions. Two areas where the enlargement of rights has taken significant organized form are welfare unions and tenant unions. The untold story of the bureaucratic abuse of welfare recipients is heartrending. The humiliation imposed is bad enough, but worse is the fact that recipients are denied substantial benefits granted to them by the law. Cloward has estimated that welfare clients actually receive only 50% of the benefits the law provides because they are consciously kept ignorant of their rights. As individuals, they have no means of informing themselves or of asserting their right to withheld benefits. Through welfare unions, however, the maximum legal limit can be obtained and deeper solutions to the problems of poverty can be sought with organized strength and collective judgment. Tenant unions are one answer to abuses resulting from the growth of public housing, which has made some cities the largest landlords and largest bureaucracies in the land. Our experience in Chicago indicates that tenant unions can not only be built, but can achieve sophisticated ends, such as formal, written, and detailed collective agreements with both private and public landlords. Welfare and tenant unions need legislation to protect members from reprisals and intimidation. Fear of loss of welfare or eviction from apartments inhibits organization. Just as labor obtained the right to organize expressed in the Wagner Act, welfare recipients and tenants need the same legal shield to facilitate mass organization. So MLK was saying that there is an arbitrary abuse of power with those who we would consider the poor and the marginalized, those who are receiving welfare, those who are receiving public housing. He was basically saying that their rights need to be protected also. We don't need to take on the attitude and the behavior that, oh, they're poor, so they don't deserve rights. Or they receive money from the government, so we could treat them any kind of way. And I'm gonna be honest, I hear Christians talking that way. So, yeah, if we're gonna follow the whole Bible, let's follow the whole Bible. Let's not decide that some people deserve to be treated humanely because they have money, and some people deserve to be treated inhumanely because they don't have money, and oh well. Maybe they don't matter to you, but they matter to God. All souls matter, remember? All lives really should matter, right? Right? Okay. Housing. We're closing. Last section. The American housing industry is a disgrace to a society which can confidently plan to get to the moon. Well, gee, MLK, tell us how you feel. The American housing industry, he says, is a disgrace to a society which can confidently plan to get to the moon. The costs of construction have risen more rapidly than most other items. Technological advances in housing construction are regularly heralded and seldom implemented. The employment situation is a scandal. It tends to be a lily-white industry with as many intricate steps to entrance as the social register. Banks and government policy have actively encouraged and even required segregated housing. Federal mortgage policy has only recently changed to favor some integrated housing. So, yeah, MLK is coming down on this construction building industry, and he's right. It tends to be a lily white industry to this day. Now, I know someone on here who can attest to that. The end result is that the United States is today a more segregated country in many respects than it was 20 years ago. Problems of education, transportation to jobs, and decent living conditions are all made difficult because housing is so rigidly segregated. The expansion of suburbia and migration from the South have worsened big city segregation. The suburbs are white nooses around the black necks of the cities. Wow. Housing deteriorates in the central cities. Urban renewal has meant Negro removal. I'll say that again. Urban renewal has meant Negro removal. We see that happening right now. Several gentrification projects are now causing community problems because you have people coming into these areas, buying up these houses, fixing them, and then realizing, oh, I don't like my neighbors. So even though they've been in this community for 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50 years, I'm now going to call the police on them because I moved in. I'm the new person in the neighborhood, but I don't recognize my neighbor. And so I'm going to call the cops. This is happening. Look it up. In other words, you're the new person on the block. They're not new. They were already there. So if you're going to come into a neighborhood and call yourself moving in, building up the property, adding value, revitalizing the neighborhood, the least you could get to do is get to know your neighbors. And don't call the police on them saying, I don't recognize these people. Who are these people in my neighborhood? They were there before. Reminds me a little bit of what we did with indigenous people in this country. I'm new here. I don't recognize you, so you got to go. Let me keep reading. Both rehabilitation and some new building in predominantly Negro areas is immediately needed to alleviate inhuman conditions, but this should be done without foreclosing possibilities of later integration. Interim solutions for ghetto housing should not obscure the need for strict enforcement of sound housing practices, but inspection, fair housing, even rehabilitation cannot solve the problems of housing for the segregated poor. New, good housing available at low cost is needed to satisfy the dwelling needs of the underclass. While housing expenditures are a fourth or fifth in the family's expenditure, they are less than a 20th of governmental expenditure. Once more priorities have to be reversed. The federal government subsidizes the non-poor twice as much as the poor when we include various forms of subsidy, such as middle-income public housing, tax deductions for mortgage interest, and real estate taxes. The federal government should be subsidizing housing activities on such a scale that all American housing meets at least minimal standards of adequacy. Housing is too important to be left to private enterprise with only one minor government effort to shape policy. We need the equivalent of a Medicare for housing. The possibilities for decent integrated housing are not as remote as increasing segregation in large cities would indicate. The model cities and new towns concepts suggest ways to remake cities and their surrounding areas. The United States is now a metropolitan nation and will become more so. Government policy can powerfully facilitate an integrated society by refusing to subsidize planned segregation, which took place under government subsidies to suburban homeowners in the 50s and 60s, and by requiring integrated communities. So he was talking about public practice again. Don't facilitate housing developments that are going to encourage segregation. Require integrated communities, and this can be done by policy. While we cannot resolve the issues of decent integrated housing immediately, we are now making the choices which would determine whether we can achieve these goals in forthcoming decades. We cannot afford to make these choices poorly. And so I will read you the last paragraph of this book again as we close. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at the flood. It ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. There is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. The moving finger writes, and having written, moves on. We still have a choice today. Nonviolent coexistence with one another or violent co-annihilation. This may well be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos or community. Think about it. Chaos or community. So his book was all about dealing with the ills of society and thinking about how we can improve the quality of life for everyone, not just for the wealthy, not just for middle class, but for the poor, the uneducated, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the disillusioned. Education, employment, human rights, rights for the poor, and housing. Here we are 49 years later, and we have people that can't seem to put together a platform that addresses those issues. Think about that. So, I hope you enjoyed this series and this book. I would definitely encourage you to get it. Again, we are moving on to The Radical King, which will be centered around sermons and speech addresses that he has given on different subjects. So we will cover a different subject every time beginning on Monday. But if you'd like to also follow that series, we will be using the hashtag The Radical King so you can follow those videos. Again, thank you for joining me live. I appreciate it. I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. And I will be back again this evening at 6 p.m. for a special broadcast on a different topic. So stay tuned, take care, and God bless. Again, thank you for joining me on this segment of MLK Uncut. This is day 25, and we have completed the reading. Again, we're going on to read The Radical King, and so that will be our next series if you'd like to keep up with us and read. Thank you again for watching. Take care, and God bless.